flashlight instead. Flashlight.
Two AA's usually last the camera about 4 or so hours.
I need batteries and stuff.
Very inefficient camera.
It's the only cost, though.
That's true.
And you can see I don't pay the photographer anything.
Price of batteries.
And you just helped things. There are actually lots of people that at least tell me that they watch it. And you know, I could actually check YouTube and see how many people have watched it, and they're not actually. Did you hear that? Yes. Okay. So Hobbes gives us how this is a train of thought, actually, a cultural history of a train of thought. And there's a great book that explains a lot of this, by the way. Remember, I'm not actually telling you anything that I thought up myself. I'm addicted to reading books. We had that discussion. I realize it doesn't seem possible, but nonetheless, I can actually read a book a day, practically. Wow. Which is amazing, I suppose. How the Scots invented modern world. That's a fascinating book, and picks up from where the Presbyterians have already done this. So it doesn't pick up where Martin Luther kind of breaks the mold, but it does pick up with the Scots.
How do you retain so well from reading, like, if you read from reading like a book a day or reading that frequently?
Cheerios? Cheerios. I don't know. How do I? It happens.
Like, yeah.
I bet you remember everything you experienced. Well, I asked you about Mufasa. How did Mufasa die?
Right.
And everybody remembers every step of the movie, right? And I bet everything you experience is retained in your brain the same way. The problem, and it's a different problem than retention, is recall, instant recall. But if I ask you, you're wearing ruby slippers and you're clicking your heels together, what are you saying to yourself? There's no place like home. So the right kind of stimulus can remind. So what did you do this morning, first thing?
First thing?
But if you can tell us.
I woke up.
You can picture it.
Yeah.
You don't have to actually tell us.
No, I just
You
got.
don't have to describe your grandmother with your red purse.
Yeah.
A snake gets out of the. We'll see it.
Right.
Don't worry.
Right. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks.
Picture Professor Snake in your grandmother's clothes. Now, so the stimulus is there. You'll remember what happens. The trouble is we don't create our own stimuli unless you already have a remember all, which tells you what you forgot, which you don't remember because, of course, that's what you've already forgotten. It's the problem with a remember all. They don't really help if you can't remember what you've already forgotten. You get the idea, right? No, so if you think about the way the brain works, I believe that it retains it records every phenomena that enters the brain. But that's not agreed upon by everyone. I mean, there's some that think, at night during rapid eye movement sleep that you're literally throwing out stuff. Oh, I don't need this. I don't need this. I don't need this.
Right.
Once you get married, you'll see you're not allowed to do that. She really wanted that, and that was really important. You should not have thrown that out. And then you'll realize clearly women remember things much better than men do. I at least recall them, right? So, plus, there's an interest, it's kind of like a puzzle. When you start out with the 40,000 piece puzzle, you start off, and everything looks the same except for everything that's going to go around the border has a straight line. So you just start working with those, and you get the border all in, and then you start working on there's a mast on this ship, and it's the only one. So you can find that, and you start building that. And you realize, oh, that has to be over here, and so, right? Start. And by the time you get to my age, you've got a few pieces over here, a few pieces over here. You don't have that much left to fill in. And as a result, you begin very quickly. And so when you read a book, you're looking for something different. Same thing happens like when I read your papers and everything. Oh, that's interesting. How did they do that? Well, I understand from Harold Bloom that you gradually get to the point where you've done enough of this that you can actually scan. We have rapid reading techniques. You can even train yourself to do that with like a computer program that basically goes through the page like this. And you surprise yourself because you can actually, when asked, give answers what happened on the page. So that's pretty interesting. Good question.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating.
I found it fascinating because over the years I've had little trouble memorizing vocabulary. Ich говорю по-русски, je parle français, ich spreche auf Deutsch. I muddle through English occasionally, and so forth, etc. Und so weiter, wie tak dalje, etc. And you can tell people that do that a lot end up talking like this. Actually, much better way of doing this. We go here to here.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get Grammarly.
I write pretty much all day.
His argument against capitalism was that it was inherently unfair. His ideas on inequality have more resonance than ever today.
I think what's surprising about a lot of Marx's writing is that you find in amongst the communism a lot of good analysis of capitalism, and actually you also find within it quite a lot of praise for capitalism.
Marx's attitude towards capitalism is basically ambiguous. He's at the same time, he was honest here, Marx, ultra fascinated. He was fully aware that this is the most productive dynamic system in the history of humanity, and so on.
And so on.
The truth is, Marx did understand that the drive for profit would achieve.
So he's one that I would put in that. He's obviously not a native speaker of English, and yet you heard the speed, the tempo. He's speaking English at the same speed that an Italian woman speaks Italian, right? Which is incredible.
Yeah.
Try to pick up what she said in Italian. Fortunately, with YouTube, you can slow them down, which is pretty cool. So that's a really interesting question, and I've thought a lot about it because I'm sure I'm not, my IQ is, I'm sure, relatively average for my age group, etc. Remember, your IQ is much higher.
Why?
The Flynn effect. I didn't mention the Flynn effect? I think you did.
It was
I
about,
did. What's wrong with your retention? Just kidding. But the Flynn effect.
Very few can be the first to do something.
Oh, did you see that flight the other day, by the way? Vandenberg? Yeah. Amazing.
People had used for shooting. And first they looked at 1865 and they found that in a minute people had only put one bullet in the bullseye. And then they found in 1898 that they'd put about 5 bullets in the bullseye in a minute. And then about 1918, they'd put 100 bullets in the bullseye. And initially, that archaeologist would be baffled. They would say, look, these tests were designed to find out how much people were steady of hand, how keen their eyesight was, whether they had control of their weapon. How could these performances have escalated to this enormous degree? Well, we now know, of course, the answer. If that Martian looked at battlefields, they would find that people had only muskets at the time of the Civil War, and that they had repeating rifles at the time of the Spanish-American War, and then they had machine guns by the time of World War I.
He's making an analogy between the rise in intelligence, in IQ, intelligence quotient, right? N, how they count your N. And increasing technology that baffles futuristic Martian archaeologists that are trying to figure out how did they get so good at shooting. It was the technology that did it. Certainly our environment is different than it used to be. So we don't have farmers that aren't able to do abstract analogies anymore. Instead, you're raised in a school environment and in a media environment that's full of abstract analogies, so that your brain is being exercised in a way that's much different than the farmer from 1860, right? And so when we look at IQ tests, we see that there's a precipitous gain in IQ. Each cohort, as far as I know, that's still happening, right? As a result, they have to make the tests harder to basically still keep the grading mechanism about the same. But as he points out, does that mean that you guys are average intelligence today, and everyone, your grandfather was essentially a moron? No, obviously not. But so there is a change, and how does that work? But there's also a flip side problem that goes with this, and it happens really in the kind of question you asked the other day, and that there are actually books and people that are saying this. Why learn all this stuff when you could just check Google? Why read a book when you can just read the synopsis in a short booklet or something, right? Etc. Have you read Ready Player One? Oh, yes? You read it, or you watched the movie? Both. Well, so you know how fast you could read. That's pretty cool. Which was better, the movie or the book? The book. Except, can you imagine turning that into a movie? Because the whole first key is won by a humongous game of Pac-Man. Imagine how boring that movie would be if you were watching him play Pac-Man for 4 hours. No, that wouldn't work, right? So instead they had, in the movie, they had him, racing a car backwards. And it's, kind of, special effects were worse than the Matrix regurgitated. So that if you're old like me, you come out of there with a headache before the movie actually starts, because the trailers for all the, and you're like, oh, my head. So the Flynn effect is the statistical fact that each cohort, as an average, that doesn't mean, of course, everyone, but as an average, your processor, your CPU, is much faster than mine. But then the question is, you're also ahistorical. So when I ask, how many of you are familiar with Henry Kissinger? No one. Few. We talked about that. Right, I'm bringing it up because no one, but you're ahistorical in that sense, right? You're not familiar with, a database of information. So, if you have a computer that's, zippity-doo, right? Absolutely, that's an old expression. means fast, right? You know, and you have, you know, a Predator 17, arr, right? You know, arr, as soon as you turn it on, you know, and the lights and everything, and it eats your children, you know, because you shouldn't have a Predator 17 in your living room if you have toddlers. It will eat them. Arr. But if you don't have any information on the hard disk, what can you do with it? Zippo, right? You need to upload stuff. Otherwise, this incredible machine will just sit there going, I'm dumb as a doornail. It's really, really fast and smart, except it doesn't have anything to think about. And it's not like, well, I think I mentioned this, well, if you can figure out someday how to get a chip that will enable you to basically be connected to the internet, so that you have the fast processor and you have the information. Wow, that would be cool. But so, and by the way, I know a lot of people that have way better retention than me. And it helps, by the way, to spend time with people like that. Which, by the way, this is kind of a secret. You're not supposed to say it. But the reason our contact time for a course is as long as it is. And you're actually supposed to be here, and I'm actually supposed to be here, and we actually have this time together, right? And we have a syllabus, and you're supposed to cover that, right? The really important experience that you're getting out of our time together is you're getting to see how I think about things. And I'm sharing that kind of process with you that I've learned from my contact time with my predator, right? So we're passing on techniques of learning, techniques of thinking, so that right now maybe you think the way I look at things is weird, but 20 years from now, hopefully you will be at least as weird, if not weirder, right? Because otherwise you won't be competing with your own group, right? Hobbes was brilliant, says Francis Bacon, and he translated, so he was familiar with lots of different languages. One of the things he did was he translated Thucydides from the Greek, because at the time, the noble classes, who were still the ones that ruled, no longer had as much time as they needed in order to do all of that learning, and yet they were the ones that were becoming the rulers. Instead of listening to the priesthood class, which would traditionally tell them what to do, and then they ought to do it, save their soul, right? They were now going to have to actually learn good governing techniques. And Hobbes was a tutor. And one of his students was the future Charles II. Charles I was his father. Charles I had his head chopped off thanks to his conflict with Parliament and Oliver Cromwell, who had become the Lord Protector, and famous, I just heard the other day that as he put his head down to have his head chopped off, he moved his beard forward and then said, "My beard hasn't done any offense, so it ought not to be chopped." So he had a sense of humor, right? Pretty interesting, right? And normally, by the way, they also paid the executioner a tip in the hopes that the executioner would make sure that it was fast and not like, oh, I missed it. Oh, well, you're dead. And Sir Nicholas Mimsy ended up the rest of his death being nearly headless. That's supposed to be funny. But that's okay. So Hobbes had Charles II as a young man. Took him places. Italy. They went stomping around in the mountains discovering fossils, fish fossils, way up like 4,000 foot level. although I don't know how they figured that out, but they could tell it was way up there, right? And they had no evolutionary sense that these and the rocks all moved around and so on and so forth. Instead, they were trying to figure out, how did this get here? Noah, the flood. That was their conclusion, right? But Hobbes is, of course, an academic. He's influenced by the Whig political point of view, which eventually has the Scots revolt against the British. They lose. Most of those that survived that were among the Whig Party then headed to the new colonies, where they inculcated their ideas among the youth there, and guess what? Then those youth grew up and became Thomas Jefferson, who then tried the Whig revolt again and succeeded. Hence, our colonies became the United States, right? So, by the way, repetition also helps. And this is probably about the 100th time I've given this course. So Hobbes, in his Leviathan, hypothesizes a state of nature which would be the way we would be and the way we would live if we didn't have a government. What would it be like? Well, it would be hell on earth, basically. A dog-eat-dog world that would be nasty, brutish, short. And solitary, don't forget solitary. And by the way, he wasn't any of those. He ended up having lots of people around him, although he's never married, never had family. But he was taken care of. He lived at a manor with friends that basically sought to take care of him. So he wasn't alone. He wasn't poor. In fact, when King Charles II came riding along one day and saw Hobbes standing there along the road, he said, "Hobbes, my old tutor, I owe you a pension." And by the way, he used to play tennis in his 90s. Imagine. So he also lived till his 90s, and his life wasn't nasty. It wasn't brutish. He never was in a fight, as far as I know, and it wasn't short. Obviously, if you're in your 90s, 92. I think. So that's just hilarious. And that he says life is solitary, nasty, brutish, short, etc. That's just hilarious, right? But that's his hypothesis of what life would be like without a government. By the way, that's really important because all the other social contract philosophers are going to disagree with Hobbes, starting with the hypothetical case of the state of nature, right? So Locke, for example, who's the one that's even more important, of course, to our particular constitution, because that was the one Thomas Jefferson in his house on the hill had 3 pictures on the wall in the front room as you came in. One was Francis Bacon, the other one was John Locke, and the other one was Sir Isaac Newton. Is that right? I saw them. So there, if you get to visit, that's pretty cool. And John Locke, of course, is the one that's going to influence ours. And so it's the state of nature that'll be different. And for John Locke, the state of nature wasn't nasty, brutish, short, etc. Instead, it was a family. Everyone cares for one another, but it gets too complex. And the reason this is an important thing, and by the way, our most contemporary, most famous political theorist, American theorist, is John Rawls, and John Rawls talks about the original position. So when we're making laws, what we have to do is think about the original position. And what we need is a veil of ignorance that we put over our heads that enables us to ignore our own individual position so that when we make laws, we can make them for the good of everybody, right? Right? But the original position is also things as they are now. So Rawls isn't trying to go back to what he hypothesizes is the state of nature. By now, we've come to realize there's no way we could actually figure out what that might actually be. And, you know, what are you trying to do, right? Rousseau, by the way, another important social contract philosopher, will argue that nature, is perfect, beautiful, and then what happens is society corrupts us. So government is evil. So the less government we have, the better off we are. Hey, that sounds familiar. By the way, one of my favorite little anecdotes, that Rousseau was a composer, opera composer. Get the idea? He wrote an opera. And it was okay. But he complained to his friend Voltaire, how do I become famous? Voltaire, in a letter, wrote back to him and said, all you have to do are write books that say just the opposite of what everybody already believes. So, he did. He wrote a book called Emile, which is about the best education. And guess what? The best education is no education. It should be student-centered. By the way, philosophy of education practice today makes everybody read Emile, and guess what? They talk about student-centered education. And actually, it was a joke. And it made him famous because that's totally the opposite of what everyone knows to be true, right? So he became famous because of Emile. Then, when he wrote about government, he said, the best government is no government, because government corrupts you. So it's better not to have any government. And by the way, the French actually tried that. It was called the French Revolution, and Robespierre is one of the most famous individuals from that time period because of the Red Terror, and the guillotine was his instrument. Right. And by the way, how did Robespierre die? The guillotine. So that's funny, right? Obviously, Rousseau's theory in practice turned out to be worse than Marx's, right? Because at least the Soviet Union lasted, what, from 1917 until 1989, roughly, 91 really, right? So you figure, pretty interesting, right? Okay, so nasty, brutish, and short, says Hobbes, and that means that when we form a government, what we're trying to do is remediate this natural state of affairs. And so for Hobbes, the main thing was security. And in order to have security, you needed to have one authority. And so basically his argument was, we form a social contract to protect ourselves by vesting all authority in a monarch who should be absolute. If we give other people other powers, then they will fight with one another and we'll end up in a state of war, which would be bad for us. So the only way to completely fix the situation is give absolute power to one individual whose interest then will be exactly the best interest of the state. You won't have to worry about competitors, won't have to worry about Nikki Haley perhaps running against him in the next election, etc., right? You won't have to worry. He's king forever. Although, keep in mind, Shakespeare's King Lear is a wonderful play about the problems of an absolute monarch who then loses his mind and goes mad, the madness of King Lear, right? You know, what happens when you've got an absolute monarch and he goes crazy, starts doing really stupid shit, you know? Then what do, right? You need someone who will have some checks and balances. No, don't have it in that situation, right? So Hobbes doesn't really address that. But so he gives us a social contract for the first time in kind of a major way. Flip side individual I've given you is Karl Marx. And have you thought about the various things that he says every society should do if they're going to be a good communist state? And if you've read this, he's basically giving you a summary of the history of the evolution of government. And then projects that eventually the conflict will lead to communism, and we've got abolition, getting rid of property, no private property, abolition of property, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax, which would be interesting if no one has any property, abolition of all rights of inheritance, so you can't pass on your wealth to your children, right? Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels, so if you fight against this and leave, which the Soviet Union did, right? Centralization of credit in the hands of the state, centralization of the means of communication in the hands of the state, extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, equal liability of all to work. Boy, he never worked. It's just fun. Right? Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries, including gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the property over the country. That's just really dumb, right? Just the opposite of what was happening in his lifetime. How about this one, though? Free education for all children in public school. That's kind of interesting. Marx tries to give us a history of the evolution of government, and argues that it's following a particular progress leading towards more freedom. And by the way, he just steals that completely from Hegel, because that was Hegel's point of view, right? And Marx is a student of Hegel, right? So how did that happen? Hegel, of course, had died in 1831. After a few years, the government had selected his friend, Friedrich Schelling, to replace him as the professor in Berlin, and Schelling had to teach what Hegel's philosophy was about, and he decided to do that to indicate Hegel was a precursor to his philosophy. So he transformed Hegel's thought just a little in order to show everyone that his philosophy was much better. By the way, the consensus today is that he's wrong, that Hegel's philosophy was much better than his own. They were closely related. It would take a lot of effort to try to see the differences between them. But nonetheless, his philosophy, which he called existence philosophy, Schelling, right? Existence philosophy, Sorry, I keep forgetting about this powerful tool. So in one of his classes, he had two students. One was Karl Marx, and the other one was Søren Kierkegaard, a Dane who had come down for graduate school. And if you watch the video, Stephanie Flanders, did you watch the video? Yes? By the way, she's pretty impressive herself. It's kind of interesting. She was the head of a company, financial company in Britain, but I believe she's going back to being a journalist again. She's 50, if you're interested in any of that stuff. But so when we look at that class, we have Søren Kierkegaard and Karl Marx, and the two of them are going to rebel against Hegel's philosophy. So here they are studying Hegel through Schelling's mind, and they both end up feeling like Hegel needs to be replaced. It's kind of interesting, right? And so if you think about it, we have Hegel up here, we have Kierkegaard. Is that right? And Marx. Famous for Marx bar. No, I'm just kidding. So Kierkegaard, Søren, right? Kierkegaard rebels against Hegel. Marx rebels against Hegel, but they're just totally opposite in their rebellions. So for Kierkegaard, you're totally individual, independent self. Hegel's wrong in thinking that society has a lot to do with the forming of your own character and the decisions you will make. Kind of a David Hume attitude about how community influences you, right? And instead, Kierkegaard insists we're completely free. And so free, in fact, that it becomes incredibly depressing. If you are interested in being depressed, I highly recommend reading Kierkegaard. He'll do the job for you. You'll be right along there singing with what's-her-face, the one that sings, "I'm standing on a bridge on a cold and rainy night. I thought you'd be here by now." What's her name? Avril Lavigne. Why do I have trouble remembering names? That's an interesting question, too.
I can make sure listen to
Again.
Yeah.
Glad to see you, Wallenby. Only use that so often, right? Why is that funny? It just is. That's what Slughorn says to Ron, because he can't remember Ron's name. Glad to see you, Wallenby. So Marx argues there's no such thing as a self. Hegel's wrong. There is no independent self that's formed by the society. There's no self at all. Everyone here all feels like you're an independent self. Raise your hand. We all do. That's because we've been programmed by our society to all say, yes, I'm a free agent, a citizen, etc. Right? So we all think that way. That's what Marx says. You're all programmed by propaganda, which makes you think a certain way. And by the way, as far as he's concerned, what we need to do in order to make a wonderful society is raise everyone by convincing them that they ought to love everyone, they ought not to be selfish, they ought to share with everyone, they ought not to have any selfish desires, etc. Totally psychologically unworkable, right? But he thought if you gave everyone the right propaganda, you would transform society into this lovey-dovey society where everyone has everything the same and works hard for everyone and they won't need a government anymore. It'll just go away. We won't have wars anymore. We won't have need for police. I mean, because after all, everyone will love one another. It'll be a utopia, right? Which is a heaven on earth, right? So, no self. That's just very interesting, right? By the way, there's a third group that continues on that I refer to as Americans. Oh, we believe everybody has their own independent self that enables them to be free and make their own choices. And oh, by the way, we've, of course, as a society, trained everyone in order to grow up to be that way. No conflict. It seems like a conflict, but actually not, right? We can also get into the argument about nurture versus nature, which keeps going back and forth. The latest I've read, by the way, it seems like nature is really much more significant than nurture. It just keeps flip-flopping constantly, right? So this is like my own little, historical way. But Marx is trying to give you an impression of how history is unfolded government-wise, but then he goes on to do something that's really illegitimate, and that is to predict what's going to happen. And so what he predicts is that capitalism can't keep going on this way. Sooner or later, the proles, which are the workers, right, are going to rise up against the bourgeoisie, which everyone knows doesn't look anything like the word, right? The bourgeois, right? Notice, you look up bourgeoisie, bourgeois, doesn't look like the word. Everyone, have you ever looked at that? And I remember thinking it meant bourgeois. I didn't know what the heck, how do you pronounce that? Of course, my pronunciations of everything is all screwed up, thanks to phonetics. There's a wonderful book, by the way, by Fussell, Paul Fussell. And you know that his name rhymes with, it sounds like Fussell because his students made a poem and rhymed his name with tussle. So Fussell must be how it's pronounced. The book is Class, a guide through the American status symbol, or status system. And by the way, I first became aware of that book when I stopped at the APU, Alaska Pacific University bookstore, over on their campus. I did teach over there 2 semesters. Tim Ralston hired me to teach social studies, sociology for the early honors program. So I got to be over there for a while. But I was surprised because Tim was using this book in one of his classes to teach people about America's classes. And when I was reading a biography of Paul Fussell, I discovered that he was just joking when he wrote this book. This was meant to be ironic, totally ridiculous. And yet, here was a fellow faculty member using it seriously. Ooh, do I tell him? It's supposed to be funny. But it is interesting, even if it is just supposed to be funny. By the way, he is also in World War II, and he's got lots of history books about World War II. So he's an interesting author as well. But let me give you a sample of where this has gone. So thinking in terms of the kind of the historic sweep of how government has changed historically, and what in our thinking has kind of enabled these changes to take place. So in this book, this is Francis Fukuyama's latest book, and in this one he's talking about the concept of identity and how identity has changed and evolved, right? And the impact that it has had on our historical progression as societies, right? And his focus on it is in the Greek concept of thymos, Thymos. Put some things up on that. So this is page 92. When we first encountered thymos and the desire for recognition of dignity in Plato's Republic, it was not generally shared among all human beings. Rather, it was the exclusive province of the guardian or warrior class, individuals who deserved recognition because of their willingness to risk their lives in a violent struggle to defend the larger community. We saw that dignity became universalized in the Christian tradition because all human beings were held to be capable of moral choice, a capacity that in Protestant thought was said to reside deep inside each individual. So Plato, Christianity, Protestantism, right? This concept of universal dignity was then secularized in the form of rational moral rules by Kant. So next stage, right? To this, Rousseau added the idea that the inner moral self was not just capable of binary moral choices, but was filled with a plenitude of feelings and personal experiences that were suppressed by the surrounding society. Remember, that was a joke. Access to those feelings rather than their suppression became the moral imperative. Dignity now centered on the recovery of the authentic inner being and society's recognition of the potential that resided in each of its members. A liberal society increasingly came to be understood not just as a political order that protected certain minimal individual rights, but rather as one that actively encouraged the full actualization of the inner self. In the Christian tradition, the inner self was the source of original sin, but was also the seat of moral choice by which sin could be overcome. Dignity rested on the ability of an individual believer to comply with a host of moral rules regarding sex, the family, relations with neighbors and rulers, at the expense of inner sinful desires. With the erosion of the shared moral horizon established by common religion in Western countries, it became less possible to award dignity only to those individuals who complied with Christianity's moral rules. Religion was instead seen as a form of idolatry or false consciousness. Recognition was due rather to the expressive inner self that might at times even want to transgress religious rules. The way these ideas played out in the 20th century of American culture can be illustrated by the work of the California Task Force to promote self-esteem and personal social responsibility, which issued the report Toward a State of Self-Esteem in 1990. The task force was the brainchild of state legislator John Vasconcellos, who was influenced by the human potential movement that flourished in the California Bay Area from the 1960s on. The latter built on the ideas of the psychologist Abraham Maslow, who became famous for his hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of the hierarchy were basic physiological needs like food and drink. In the middle were social needs like safety and security, and at the top was something Maslow labeled self-actualization. He argued that most people fail to realize the greater part of their potential. Self-esteem was critical to self-actualization since individuals were held back by low estimates of their own capabilities. Consistent with the modern concept of identity was the idea that the individual's self-actualization was a higher need than the requirements of the broader society. The task force defined self-esteem in the following terms. Being alive as a human being has an innate importance, an importance to which the authors of the Declaration of Independence referred when they declared that all people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This conviction concerning the dignity of every human personality has long been part of our nation's moral and religious heritage. Every person has unique significance simply because the precious and mysterious gift of life as a human being has been given. This is an inherent value which no adversary or adversity can take away. The report noted, appreciating my own worth and importance does not depend on measuring the quantity or quality of my abilities against those of someone else. Everybody gets an A. Every person's abilities are valuable and needed. You're all such great students. Each of us has a contribution to make to our society. Thanks, that's the best McDonald's hamburger I've ever eaten. It elaborated, the point is not to become acceptable or worthy, but to acknowledge the worthiness that already exists. Our feelings are part of this, and accepting them builds our self-esteem. We each can celebrate our special race, ethnicity, and culture. We can appreciate our bodies, our gender, and our sexuality. We can accept our ideas, feelings, and creativity. In these few pages, that's all part of the report, right? In these few pages, we can see the expression of a long line of ideas that ultimately trace back to Rousseau, which was a joke. That each of us has an inner self buried deep within. That it is unique and a source of creativity, that the self residing in each individual has an equal value to that of others. There are some absolutely important aspects to that we can agree. But that the self is expressed not through reason, but through feelings. Feelings, feeling. And finally, that this inner self is the basis of the human dignity that is recognized in political documents such as the Declaration of Independence. It is, in short, a clear statement of the post-Rousseauian concept of identity. The California Task Force report embodies a huge internal contradiction, however, which in turn reflects the fundamental tension between isothemia and megalothemia. Isothemia is we're all the same, and megalothemia is I'm so much superior to you. It's the Trump kind of. It asserts that each individual has a creative and capable inner self. It strives to be non-judgmental, warning that we should not compare ourselves to others or allow ourselves to be judged by other people's standards. Kind of like the individual education plan, the IEP, for the folks that can't hack the norm, right? And so what we have to do is figure out an individual education plan for this person. And by the way, if they can't live up to that, then we revise it and dumb it down and dumb it down until, hey, you passed. Well, I won't read more, but you get the idea. Bless you. Gesundheit, gute Zdrowie, a votre santé. It can be annoying, actually, knowing too many languages.
Question would be about pizza. How many slices would you like? 8 or 12?
Okay. If you had 100 people and they were all hungry and you had one extra large pizza, would you share any of it with those 100 people? There could be a second aspect to this. They don't know you have it. If you have an extra large pizza from Pizza Man, and you're in a camp, a tent camp, you know, survivors, you know, they just floated over in open boats from Syria. And they're all starving because none of the Greeks want to feed them because then they'll just stay.
But how many slices of pizza do you have?
Slice it however you like.
So do you share with them or not?
Would you share with them, or would you try to stay in your tent and keep them from finding you eating the whole pizza yourself?
Do you have money to buy your own pizza? Should buy another?
Yeah. Just because they gave all their money to the people that rented them the boats, the leaky boats that they hoped they would drown in on the way across to Greece. So they have no money. I have little babies, little children. Oh, they're bigger and they're big enough. You know, in fact, how many of them actually floated to Greece today?
The quiz question is the pizza question? Okay. Just right.
It's always about food. There's a theme.
The best question.
We're going to sneak inside you here.
Was this fun? I'm too preachy. I feel too preachy. I don't know why I'm getting
It's fun. You're perfectly fine. It's a good class.
age. How many? I guess the older I get, the more worried I am about the way you guys are going to run things. I have. I've been teaching at UAA since 1995. And my average is 2 intro to philosophy classes per semester, including the summer. So that's 6 a year times 23. Easily that would give me over 100 iterations of this class. Obviously I've changed somewhat.
Right, and there's no way to extend the most preaching class.
But I have done Hobbes. Hobbes is, you know, so I've always been following the canon. There's a few individuals that have been added to it, but it's Mary Wollstonecraft. I've added more actually with this text. That's why with this text I said this, right?
I saw that.
Yes.
Great.
I got a blurb. Must turn it off. Thanks. And in fact, I've got stuff I have to do.